Some of life's biggest battles come at the end. Not just the physical challenges that so often come with aging that I'm discovering more and more about, but also the emotional, psychological, and spiritual challenges. And since setting out on this journey with David together, I have gone through 2 more birthdays, as have you. And I now find myself in my 70th year. I'm not sure how that happened, but it has. My eldest daughter is 42 today. That is shocking. So perhaps it's appropriate because in this final focus on David, we're looking at him in his old age. And we are considering something he got very badly wrong as an old man, and something that he got supremely right. But first of all, we need to tidy up a few details in our story. Absalom, who rebelled against his father, the king, was now dead, the rebellion over. But restoring David to the throne and uniting the nation after a divisive rebellion and civil war were not straightforward. 2 Samuel 19 records, throughout the tribes of Israel, all the people were arguing amongst themselves, saying, "The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies. He is the one who rescued us from the hand of the Philistines, but now he has fled the country to escape from Absalom, and Absalom, whom we anointed to rule over us, has died in battle. So why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?" So there were all kinds of tensions and divided loyalties. The tribes still had their individual identities, and the tensions between the tribes of Judah and Benjamin on one hand and the other 10, they threatened to perpetuate the instability and division in the nation. So David first appealed to the tribe of Judah. He promised to make Amasa, who had been commander-in-chief of Absalom's army, he promised to make him the new army chief of a united nation. And David won over the hearts of Judah, so they sent men formally to bring him across the river Jordan back to Jerusalem, to the capital city, to retake the throne. And on that journey back, the return of the king, David encountered some of the people he had encountered on his journey out when he was fleeing the city. And there's some fascinating stories for you to think about. I'll mention a couple of them, but these are great things just to think about what's going on. For example, Shimayai was one of the people. Now, he was the one who had so publicly cursed David when he had been fleeing the city. Remember, he threw stones at him, he threw dirt at him and his followers, and he proclaimed that this rebellion was God's judgment upon David. But now David had been vindicated. So what would Shimayai do now, and what would David do to him? Well, Shimayai took courage in both hands. He was one of the first to come to meet David, and he simply flung himself at David's feet for his mercy. And David, who hadn't punished him initially for cursing him, wasn't now going to punish him for recognizing his fault and repenting. This was a time for unity, not reprisals, not the settling of personal scores. It's a fascinating story. Mephibosheth also was there. And what a story that is. It's presented to us really as a trilogy of little episodes through the story of David. But if you remember the last encounter between David and, well, not Mephibosheth, but Mephibosheth, the carer who was looking after him, Ziba, David had been deceived because Ziba, who was supposed to be looking after Mephibosheth, who was very badly disabled, had lied to David about Mephibosheth, had told David that Mephibosheth's loyalty had been transferred to Absalom, that he had gone over to the other side. And David had been taken in by what turned out to be slander, he hadn't waited to find out the other side of the story, and had immediately ordered that all the property he had given to Mephibosheth should now be given to Ziba. But Mephibosheth was here on the return journey, and the true story came out. Mephibosheth had not gone over to Absalom. In fact, he had attempted to get to David, despite his serious disability, but Ziba had betrayed him and got to David first and then slandered him. Mephibosheth had remained loyal to David the whole time. What was the evidence? Well, Mephibosheth pointed to his hair and to his feet. He hadn't cut his hair or trimmed his toenails or even washed himself since David had left. There wasn't much he could do to demonstrate his loyalty, but he did something. The evidence of his loyalty was there for all to see and perhaps even to smell, who knows. And in a rather disappointing attempt to make up for his error, David now ordered that the property and land should be shared between Mephibosheth and Ziba. But Mephibosheth didn't care about the property. Ziba can have it all, he said. It's enough for me that the true king has returned. What a great heart he had. I love this story. And I'm challenged by it because it raises a very interesting question, at least for me, because I find myself in a similar situation to Mephibosheth. Because my king is in exile. He hasn't returned yet. He will one day. And I claim to be a Christian. I claim to be a follower of Christ, loyal to Jesus. What would I point to as evidence of my loyalty? Well, not my hair or my toenails, but perhaps by not denying his name before my peers, perhaps by keeping his word even when I don't like what it says. How would you answer my question? If you're a Christian, what would you point to that demonstrates unmistakably that whatever anybody else does, your loyalty is to Jesus, the rightful king? Because when the king is in exile, loyalty will be tested. Mephibosheth couldn't make any great gestures. He couldn't fight. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a powerful man. He found simple ways in his daily life and lifestyle. So there's a topic for discussion today over lunch and in the home groups, the small groups this week. How can we demonstrate our loyalty to Jesus as king? Well, there was much still to be done. The 10 tribes got angry with Judah and Benjamin. They accused them of having stolen the king. We have 10 shares in him. You've only got 2. We've got the bigger claim. And a troublemaker called Sheba took advantage of the disagreement, believe it or not, to start another rebellion. Well, David had learned his lesson from the first one, not to remain passive. And fearing an even worse situation than had been the case under Absalom's rebellion, he sent his best troops after Sheba, who holed up in a city. And you can read the story. There was another wise woman. Isn't it amazing the number of wise women we read about in the Old Testament? I shouldn't say, isn't it amazing? That sounds terrible. But I'm not sure I read of as many wise men. But anyway, that's another matter. There was a wise woman who put an end to Sheba's nonsense and saved the city and saved the nation. David then was faced with some very complex legacy issues from King Saul's reign. For example, Saul's covenant-breaking slaughter of the Gibeonites, Saul's failure to subdue the Philistines. David himself wasn't a young warrior anymore. He had to retire from actively leading his troops in battle. But he did have a strong group of commanders who secured the security and the prosperity of the nation. And when you stand back from it, David's achievements by any standards are absolutely remarkable. Building a united nation out of very little, establishing a capital city that all recognized, subduing all his enemies, making Israel into a small but powerful nation. This was the golden age. He even had time to write some more songs. But it was in this period, at the end of his life, that he made one of his worst and most foolish mistakes. We read about it in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel. So David said to Joab and the commanders of the troops, "Go and count the Israelites from Beersheba to Dan, then report back to me so I may know how many there are." But Joab replied, "May the Lord multiply his troops 100 times over, my lord the king. Are they not all my lord's subject? Why does my lord want to do this? Why should he bring guilt on Israel?" The king's word, however, overruled Joab. So Joab left and went throughout Israel and then came back to Jerusalem. He reported the number of the fighting men to David. In all Israel, there were 1,100,000 men who could handle a sword, including 470,000 in Judah. But Joab did not include Levi and Benjamin in the numbering because the king's command was repulsive to him. And this command was also evil in the sight of God. So he punished Israel. And then David said to God, "I have sinned greatly by doing this. Now I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing." Now in the parallel passage in 2 Samuel 24, we read, "The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, 'Go number Israel and Judah.' Whereas Chronicles tells us that Satan rose up against Israel and incited David. So which was it? Who incited David? Was it Satan? Was it God? Was it David himself? Skeptics and theologians have argued over this seeming contradiction for a long time, and I'm going to have to leave them to it since I'm neither a skeptic nor a theologian. But I can see how both Satan and God could be involved. Satan playing on the weakness in David, tempting him to do it. God seeing the evil intention in David's heart, doing what we read about in Romans chapter 1, giving him up to it to expose the sin and to judge it. The fact remains, however, that David did it. And the question is, why? God didn't ask him to. There was no practical necessity that required it. Joab, his commander-in-chief, who was not generally noted for his godliness, even he could see it was wrong and strongly opposed it, but David insisted. He even overruled his commander-in-chief, probably the only time in his life that he managed successfully to do that. Listen again to Joab's question. Why does my lord the king want to do this? Or as the ESV translates it, why does he delight in this thing? Why does any great leader delight in numbers? Especially as they get older. I think the unspoken answer is obvious. It's pride. This wasn't done in celebration of all that God had done through him. This was more a question of, look what we've done. Look how big the army is. Look what we've achieved. Now, Joab, perfectly happy for him to enjoy the results of his reign. Indeed, Samuel tells us that Joab said, look, may God multiply it. It's fantastic. Enjoy it. But don't quantify it. Don't sit and gloat over it like a miser gloats over the pennies he's counting. Don't turn into that kind of person who boasts in the number of tanks they have and missiles and nuclear weapons. It's foolish, as David eventually came to admit, but only after he had done it. David's heart struck him after he had numbered the people, and he said to the Lord, I've sinned greatly in what I've done. But now, O Lord, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. It's a striking word, the foolish behavior of an old man. When you're an old man like me, how do you assess your life? With numbers? Such a huge temptation, isn't it? I've got more cars than he has. I have a bigger boat. I've grown a bigger company. I've traveled to more countries. I have a larger pension pot. Or if you're a church leader, I've led more people to Christ. I've preached to bigger crowds. I've planted more churches. I've written more books. Pride is always the great enemy, the great evil at the heart of human sin and rebellion against God. It's what C.S. Lewis once called the great sin. It is through pride, he wrote, that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. And again, pride is spiritual cancer. It eats up the very possibility of love or contentment or even common sense. And so as the great enemy, it is the great battle. The hardest to eradicate, even in, or perhaps especially in, old age. As they say, there's no fool like an old fool. And all the hard work done in youth and adulthood, hearts and minds should be turning increasingly upwards and onwards, higher up and further in, delighting in God, losing sight of ourselves by comparison. But instead, David starts to focus on his achievements, taking delight in his numbers. Of course, it's an equal and opposite mistake to focus on achievements and numbers and see how few they have been and descend into despair. This is the supreme battle, and to give into it as David did was a serious mistake, especially as God's king, and God came down very hard on it. David's pride resulted in the death of thousands until David himself stood up in public, took the blame, and offered to take the punishment on himself that his foolishness had brought on his people. Repentance is not simply for when we first come to Christ. If we're wise, repentance is just about for every day. As God reveals things to us that go deep into our heart, doesn't do it all at once in life, because that would overwhelm us. But as we move on, it's as if God says to us, now I need to pull back the curtain a little further. I need to show you just how deep this thing goes, how deep this sin is. Don't despair. My son has died for it all. But we need to deal with it. And here God dealing with this deep tendency that David was probably unaware of until it had happened. And in shock and humiliation, he comes in deep repentance towards God. It's a powerful lesson. But thankfully, the story doesn't end here. 1 Chronicles 23 tells us that when David was old and full of days, he made Solomon his son king over Israel. And then in chapter 29, verse 22, it tells us, and they made Solomon the son of David king the second time. So how did that work? Well, what happened was this, that David reigned as king until the nation was united, his enemies were subdued, Jerusalem established, and then he made his son Solomon co-regent to look after the practical affairs of the kingdom. And then some years later, on his deathbed, finally David made Solomon king the second time, that is, king in his own right. And why this arrangement? Because David's eyes now were on the future. What was in his mind was the great project of building God's house in Jerusalem, the temple of the Lord. We read in 1 Chronicles 22, then David said, "Here shall be the house of the Lord God." Fantastic statement. There was nothing there. But here it will be. He could see into the future. He had his eyes on this fantastic construction. And here, the altar of burnt offering for Israel. And David commanded to gather together the resident aliens who were in the land of Israel. He set stone cutters to prepare dressed stones for building the house of God. David also provided great quantities of iron for nails, for the doors of the gates, and for clamps, as well as bronze in quantities beyond weighing, and cedar timbers without number. For the Sidonians and Tyrians brought great quantities of cedar to David. For David said, "Solomon, my son, is young and inexperienced, and the house that is to be built for the Lord must be exceeding magnificent, of fame and glory throughout all lands. I will therefore make preparation for it." So David provided materials in great quantity before his death. This excites me. And it's not because I'm into architecture and building. David devoting his final years to preparing materials for the future. That things that will be necessary for this great project, the greatest building project in Israel's history so far. And not just the materials, but the people. David thought it through meticulously. He finally did the right kind of numbering. He worked out that for the temple to function in all its glory, he would need 24,000 for the general work of the temple. That's some civil service. He had it sorted out. 4,000 to look after the entrances. 6,000 officers and judges, presumably to deal with the day-to-day personnel and pastoral issues. And, I love this, 4,000 musicians and singers. Can you imagine the work, the preparation that went into this? Now, let me ask you, if you were retired, some of you are dreaming of it, some of you are dreading it. But if you were retired, you didn't need to work anymore to pay for your daily cornflakes, what would you do with your life? Your time, your acquired experience and skills? Well, you say, I've always wanted to retire so I could work in my golf handicap. Well, yes, that would be enjoyable. I don't play golf myself for reasons that would be obvious if you invited me. For myself, I would love to learn more about bird photography and get to photograph some more of the world's great landscapes. Nothing wrong with these things if you have the opportunity. When Abraham retired, in inverted commas, God allowed him, it seems, to have a bit of fun before bringing him to heaven. But is there anything else you'd like to do? Is there a grand project that you could play a part in? What if you had the opportunity to invest more in preparing materials for a spectacular building? The most significant and beautiful building project in the history of this world. In fact, in an eternal building, the dwelling place of God. There is a magnificent cathedral in the city of Ulm in Germany. Relying entirely on local funding, it took 500 years to complete, finished in 1890. I so admire those generations. Those people who started out knowing that they would never see it physically. But they invested their life, generations coming and going, passing the baton on to the next generation. Fantastic motivation, fantastic commitment. But the difference here is that we, as believers, have a much greater project and we will see it. That's the difference. The greatest building project in history. Listen to Paul in Ephesians 2. You are no longer strangers and aliens, but you're fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure being joined together grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. This is the greatest building project in history. Building a spiritual community, the dwelling place of God by His Spirit, that will be the administrative center of the universe to come. It's an amazing vision. According to Peter, we're part of that. We're living stones in this building. And if we're still here, it means we need a wee bit more polishing before we're ready to take our full part. A few edges need chipped away before we can take up the place that God has designed for us. And we have the opportunity to prepare ourselves, prepare the materials for the part that we will bring to it. There's a great story in the book of Acts, chapter 9, where a widow called Dorcas had given herself to all kinds of good works for others. She's a believer. And out of her love for the Lord, she loved others. She'd given herself in particular to using her time and skills to make clothing for other widows like her. But she died. And in tribute to her, all the widows that she had helped and given clothing, they came and they brought the clothing she had made for them. And they brought them together and they showed them to the Apostle Peter. And then God did something amazing. He performed a miracle through Peter and brought Dorcas back to life again. And I love to picture the scene where Dorcas wakes up and looks around, and what does she see? Well, she sees the people and she sees the things that she had prepared in her previous life. What an image to plant in the book of Acts early on. This isn't all about the great evangelists and the wonderful missionaries and those great Christian leaders that we need, but people using their sewing and knitting skills and embroidery out of love for Christ and their craft and their art and their music and their skills with children and with young people and with older people, seeking to build faith, build vision, to get them to look beyond the reductionism of this world and expand their vision to this eternal building that God is building secure in the heavens. Christ invites us to lay up treasure in heaven, to use the opportunity we're given. We're not all given the same opportunity. We're not all given the same wealth. The test is not what I would do if I'd been given somebody else's. It's what I do with what I've been given, what you do with what you've been given. And heaven is scarcely a reality if we're not prepared to invest in it. Brings me back to the question. Dorcas had lots of evidence to point to. What would I point to? What about my eternal investment? See, there's different kinds of wealth. There's time, there's experience, there's wisdom. All those skills you learned working in the checkout in Tesco's. All those skills you learned caring for kids and caring for elderly parents. What do you think is going to happen to those? They're going to be discarded, are they? All those things you learn from playing team sports, all those things you learn from working on your maths and fighting with irregular French verbs late on a Friday afternoon, with me glowering at you. What's it for? Ultimately, what's it for? It's not simply that you can get a job here and earn some money here to keep you going here. Everything, Ephesians tells us, is going to be summed up in Christ. Everything. All those skills, all that knowledge, all those abilities, all that art and creativity. It's not wasted. Everything plays a part. I love the fact that he talks about iron to make nails. Isn't that great? Who would have thought of that? I mean, down to the detail. You think, I'm an only bit of rusty iron. There's no use for me. Transformed into nails in the doors in the house of the Lord. This is a fantastic vision. But what happens in this world is it tries to lock us down into thinking that this is real life. That this is all there is. So grab all you can while you can get it. Growing old brings all kinds of changes. And if we're not careful, it can be easy to slide into cynicism, become even more judgmental, critical of others, more complaining, even allow bitterness to take root. And none of that is helpful either to others or to ourselves. And in fact, it makes other people even more worried about getting old. Look what it's doing to Gilbert. I don't want to get old like him. Now, I understand some of it is beyond our ability to control. It's to do with genetics and personality and physical ability and so on. But some of it we can do something about. Perhaps more than we can think. Every Christmas, I sit down and watch A Christmas Carol with George C. Scott. It has to be George C. Scott. Just to encourage me that even old people can change. But listen, you younger folks could help us. You could actually help us. A bit of sympathy now and again. Listening to the things that can so easily trouble us as we get older. Because we don't actually have as much energy, believe it or not. Just something happens. And you're wiped out, a day with the kids and you're going, we used to take that in our stride. 4 kids, under 6. Busy jobs, it wasn't a problem. And now, we love our grandchildren. But you'll know all about it one day. It might be an idea just to get to know a wee bit about it now. Just to... When David got old, he got cold. They tried to warm him up. Intriguingly, they tried to do it by bringing him a nurse who was also Miss Israel. I lie not. It's there. 1 Kings 1. Read it for yourself. This is great stuff. But the poor old guy couldn't find a single spark in him, so that was the end of that. But please do seek to encourage us that there's stuff that we can still contribute, because we're still here. There's stuff we can still contribute to pass on Wisdom, experience, patience, all those things, perspective, prayer. See, the body of Christ is built up by that which every part supplies. Let's seek to put that into action. So through our interactions, that which every relationship really supplies, through the interactions of the parts, we encourage one another, and all the more as we see the day drawing near. So let's avoid the mistake, but let's go for the vision. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for all that we have learned in our learning through this magnificent story. May it stick with us. May the stories of it stick as images, illustrations in our mind. We think of Mephibosheth standing before David with his disheveled hair and his toenails all unkempt, as demonstrations that he had never waned for a second in his loyalty. May that be true of us at a spiritual and moral and intellectual level, demonstrating our loyalty to the Lord Jesus. Thank you for your word to us. Encourage us. May we as a body encourage one another, from the eldest to the youngest, that all have a part to play in this great eternal building project, the dwelling place of God by his Spirit. We thank you in Jesus' name.